He was 58 years old, standing in the snow with a ring in his fist and a town full of people waiting to watch him fail. They said he was too old, too broken, too far past the kind of man a woman like her would ever choose. And the worst part? He believed every word of it. This is the story of a man who had already buried his heart beside his wife, and the woman stubborn enough to dig it back out. If this story finds you tonight, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this has traveled. Hit like and stay with me until the end. You'll want to see how this one turns out. The cold came early that year. It always did in Grover County. That was the one thing you could count on in Montana. The cold never waited for anyone to get ready. By the third week of October, the creek behind Gideon Ashcroft's property had already started to skin over with a pale, papery layer of ice that crackled when the horses stepped near the bank. By the 1st of November, the skin had become bone. The mountains to the north had gone completely white, and the sky had taken on that particular shade of gray that wasn't quite threatening and wasn't quite forgiving. Just an endless, flat ceiling pressing down on everything beneath it. Gideon didn't mind the cold. He'd stopped minding it a long time ago. He was up before 4 every morning, the way he'd been for the better part of 40 years. He didn't need an alarm or a rooster. His body just knew. He'd lie there in the dark for a moment or two, staring at the ceiling boards he'd replaced himself after a bad storm in '79, and then he'd sit up and put his feet on the floor, and that was that. The day had started whether he was prepared for it or not. The ranch house was a solid structure. Nothing fancy, but nothing embarrassing either. 3 rooms and a sleeping loft he never used anymore. A kitchen with a cast-iron stove that Gideon kept burning from October straight through to April. A sitting room with 2 chairs, one of which had a quilt draped over the arm that hadn't moved in 11 years. He was aware of this fact every single morning when he walked through the room. He was also aware that he never moved the quilt, and he never sat in that chair, and that these were either the behaviors of a man who honored his grief or a man who had let it slowly swallow him whole. He wasn't entirely sure which. Outside, the ranch ran about 420 acres, most of it grazing land, a good chunk of it rough terrain that climbed toward the tree line before the elevation made it useless for cattle. He ran about 200 head, which was respectable for a man working largely alone. He'd had a hired hand named Pete Delaney for 3 seasons, but Pete had taken a wife in Billings the previous spring and hadn't come back. Gideon didn't blame him. He'd told Pete to go. He'd meant it, mostly. The work filled the hours well enough. That was the thing about ranching. It was relentless in a way that was almost merciful. There was always something that needed doing, always something broken or in danger of breaking, always an animal that needed attention, or a fence that needed mending, or a storm that needed preparing for. You didn't have a lot of time to sit around and think about things you couldn't change. The land had a way of keeping your hands busy even when your mind drifted. Gideon's mind drifted less than it used to. Or maybe he'd just gotten better at pretending it didn't. He was in town the morning he first spoke to Eliza Rowan. He didn't often go to Clearwater. That was what the town was called, Clearwater, though it wasn't particularly clear and wasn't near anything you'd call water anymore since the creek had shifted course back in the '70s. He went in for supplies every 2 or 3 weeks, usually early enough that he could get what he needed from Henderson's general store before it got crowded, exchange whatever pleasantries were necessary, and be back on the road before noon. He wasn't antisocial exactly. He just found that most conversation in Clearwater eventually circled back to questions he didn't feel like answering. "You doing all right out there alone, Gideon? Don't you get lonely? You ever think about—" He knew how to cut those conversations off. He'd had years of practice. The schoolhouse sat at the western edge of town, a modest building with a bell tower that had been leaning slightly since the winter of '83, and which the town council had been discussing straightening ever since without taking any action. Gideon noticed it every time he rode past, not because he cared about the bell tower especially, but because he was the kind of man who noticed things that needed fixing and couldn't entirely let the observation go. He had no particular business near the schoolhouse that morning. He'd finished at Henderson's, loaded the wagon, and was making his way back to the main road when he noticed the door of the schoolhouse standing open despite the temperature sitting somewhere in the low 20s. That stopped him. Not dramatically. He didn't rein in his horses with any urgency or leap down from the wagon. He just paused and looked at the open door and thought, "That's not right." Heat pouring out of a building into a Montana November morning was the kind of thing that registered automatically to a man who'd spent decades thinking about resources. He climbed down from the wagon and walked over. The woman inside was crouched in front of the schoolhouse stove, which sat against the western wall and which was clearly not drawing properly. She had the access panel open and was examining the interior with the focused, frustrated expression of someone who understood that the problem was obvious but hadn't yet identified it. She was wearing a dark wool dress and a coat that was practical enough but not quite heavy enough for what November in Montana required. Her dark hair was pulled back, though a few pieces had come loose. She had ink on her left hand, just below the knuckle of her index finger. She looked up when she heard him in the doorway, and she didn't startle the way some people did. She just looked at him steadily, as if she'd been expecting someone to show up eventually and wasn't particularly surprised it had happened. "Does this building belong to you?" she asked. Her voice was direct. Not rude, just direct. "No," Gideon said. Door was open. Seemed like a problem. She looked at the stove. "The stove is the problem. It won't draw. I've been fighting with it for an hour and I can't work out why." Gideon came inside. The schoolroom was colder than it should have been, maybe 40 degrees, 45, which explained why the children hadn't arrived yet. Classes wouldn't start until the room was heated to something livable. He crouched down beside the stove, not beside her but a few feet away, and looked at the mechanism. "Damper's closed," he said. She went still for a moment. "I beg your pardon?" He reached up and turned the damper handle, a simple half rotation, and they both heard the draw change immediately, the hollow sound of air moving properly through the pipe. She stared at it. Then she sat back on her heels and put a hand over her eyes. "I have been crouching in front of this stove for 1 hour," she said, in a tone that was trying to find the humor in the situation and not entirely succeeding. "Happens," Gideon said. He stood up and brushed the coal dust off his knee. "It happens to people who don't know what a damper is, which is apparently me." She stood as well, and now he could see her more clearly. She was somewhere in her late 20s or early 30s, he guessed. Younger than he'd initially registered, or maybe about the same. His calibration for age had shifted over the years in ways he didn't always trust. She had the kind of face that showed what she was thinking, which was either a quality or a liability, depending on the situation. "You're new," he said. It wasn't a question. "Is it that obvious? Teacher before you was here 9 years, knew about dampers." She laughed at that, a real laugh, not polite, and he found himself surprised by it, not unpleasantly. "I'm Eliza Rowan," she said. "I arrived from St. Paul 6 weeks ago. Apparently 6 weeks was not enough time to learn everything there is to know about cast iron stoves." Gideon Ashcroft. He didn't offer his hand because his hands were dirty from the stove and from the morning's loading, and she didn't seem to expect it. "Ashcroft," she repeated, as if filing the name away. "Do you have children at the school?" "No." A brief pause. She nodded once, accepting that without making it awkward. "Well," she said, "thank you for the damper lesson, Mr. Ashcroft. You may have saved my students from pneumonia." "Probably," he said, and turned toward the door. "Do you want some coffee?" He stopped. He wasn't sure why. He had things to do. He always had things to do. "I have a pot," she added. "I brought it from my rooms this morning because I thought it was going to be a long fight with the stove. It's still hot, or it was. I haven't checked." He should have said no. He was aware of this. "Sure," he said instead. They had coffee standing near the stove once it had started putting out some actual warmth, both of them holding their cups and watching it work as though it deserved some supervision after the morning's earlier failure. The coffee was strong and slightly overbrewed, the kind that came from leaving the pot on heat too long, and Gideon drank it without comment because it was coffee and because the cold had gotten into him on the wagon ride over. "What's St. Paul like?" he asked, and then wondered why he'd asked that. She considered the question with what appeared to be genuine thought rather than a reflexive answer. "Loud," she said finally. "Busy. More people than you can keep track of. There are days when you walk down the street and you don't recognize a single face, and somehow that's not strange to anyone." He looked at the stove. "Doesn't sound like Montana." "No," she agreed. "Not at all." She paused. "I wanted something different. My family thought I had lost my mind." "Maybe you did." She looked at him, and he wasn't sure if he'd said something offensive, but she didn't look offended. She looked thoughtful. "Maybe," she said. I'm still deciding. Outside, the sound of children's voices approached from the direction of the main road. The noise of a group arriving, coats and boots, and the particular chaos of young people in motion. She set her cup down on her desk and straightened her coat, that small automatic adjustment people made when they were about to be seen in a professional capacity. Thank you again, she said. Really. Gideon drained the last of his coffee and set the cup down on the nearest bench. Don't forget to check the damper, he said. Tomorrow morning. I will put it on a list, she said seriously, and he could tell she was trying not to smile. He walked out into the cold and climbed back up to his wagon and drove north toward his ranch. And that was all. That was the whole thing. A closed damper and a cup of bad coffee, and a woman from St. Paul who didn't know Montana yet. He didn't think about it again for the rest of the day. Or so he told himself, for a while. In Clearwater, small things traveled fast. There wasn't much by way of entertainment in a frontier town in November. The harvest was done, the weather kept people closer to home, and the social calendar was essentially a rotating series of church suppers and the occasional gathering at the Flint and Spur, the only establishment in town that sold whiskey and still pretended to be something classier than a saloon. In that kind of environment, a story was precious. Anything that could be told and retold, examined from different angles, elaborated upon. That kind of material was currency. The fact that Gideon Ashcroft had been seen walking into the schoolhouse and staying for the better part of 20 minutes was, to Clearwater, approximately equivalent to a man walking off a cliff in broad daylight. People noticed it in the way they noticed unusual weather. They cataloged it. They discussed it in the bread aisle at Henderson's, and over the counter at the post office, and in the small, warm parlors of the houses on the main street. Gideon was aware of this because he was not stupid, and because Martha Hensley, who was the wife of the grain merchant and who had positioned herself as the primary information exchange in Clearwater for the past 15 years, made a point of mentioning it to him the very next time he came into town. I saw you over at the schoolhouse the other morning, Martha said. She said it in that particular tone that was trying to be casual and achieving exactly the opposite. Damper was closed, Gideon said, and moved past her toward the dry goods. She's a pretty young woman, Martha said, to his back. He bought his flour and his coffee beans and a new pair of work gloves and left without answering, because the statement didn't require an answer. It was designed to provoke one. He'd gotten good at not providing what people were fishing for. But Martha had said pretty young woman, and the sequence of words lodged somewhere in his mind without his permission, and he turned them over without meaning to, the way you'd turn over a stone without quite realizing your hand was moving. Eliza Rowan was not the first young woman in Clearwater. The town had its share of them. Ranchers' daughters, wives of younger men, the girls who helped at the general store. Gideon had managed to treat them all with exactly the same calibrated indifference that he treated most people, which was not unkindness, but rather a kind of careful neutrality that kept everyone at a comfortable distance. He wasn't sure why this one was different. He wasn't, in fact, sure that she was. The second encounter happened 12 days after the first, and it happened because Eliza Rowan had no particular talent for staying in lanes that were drawn for her. She appeared at his property in the early afternoon on a Thursday, riding a brown mare that Gideon recognized as one of Jack Brennan's from the livery, which meant she'd borrowed or rented it for the day. He was at the fence line on the eastern edge of the property when he noticed her coming up the road, and for a moment he just watched her approach without moving. She rode decently but not confidently, the posture of someone who had learned rather than grown up with it. She saw him at the fence and changed her direction without hesitation. "Mr. Ashcroft," she called when she was close enough. He set down the fencing tool he'd been holding. "Miss Rowan?" She reined in beside the fence. Up close, he could see she had a canvas bag over one shoulder and that she looked like she'd been riding in the cold for long enough to put some color in her face. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, in a tone that implied she was willing to interrupt. "You're interrupting," he said. "What do you need?" She didn't flinch at the bluntness. "One of my students, Thomas Greer's boy, the youngest one, Daniel. He mentioned you used to know his grandfather. The Greer family had some books that they've apparently been holding on to since the grandfather passed, and they're not readers, and they didn't know what to do with them, so they sent them to school. The problem is that 2 of them are in Latin, and I don't read Latin, and I don't know anyone in Clearwater who does. Thomas Greer thought you might." Gideon looked at her for a moment. "Thomas Greer sent you out here." "He mentioned you. I decided to come on my own. She paused. I thought you might not have come in if I'd sent a message. This was accurate, and they both seemed to know it without acknowledging it directly. I read some Latin, he said. Not well. Well enough to tell me what these are? She opened the canvas bag and produced 2 volumes, old ones with worn leather covers, and the particular smell of books that had been kept in conditions that weren't ideal for books. She leaned down from the horse and held them out. He took them. He examined the spines, turned the first one open to the title page. This one's a theological text, he said. Probably late 1700s. Not much use to a school. He looked at the second one. This is more interesting. It's a natural history. Plants, animals. Some of it would have been accurate even. He turned a few pages. The illustrations were detailed, slightly faded. This one's worth something. She was watching his face as he read, which he noticed. What? He said. You read Latin, she said, as if this was either unexpected or not, and she hadn't decided which. I told you I did. Most men I've met in Montana have told me they did things they couldn't actually do. It seemed worth verifying. He handed the books back up to her. The first one you can leave with the minister if you want to be rid of it. The second one belongs in a classroom. That's what I thought. She settled the books back in the bag. Can I ask you something? He picked up his fencing tool. You can try. How long have you been out here alone? The question landed differently than he expected. Not in an intrusive way, not in a Martha Hensley way, just straight. Like she wanted to know because she was curious, not because she wanted something to tell someone. 11 years, he said. She didn't say I'm sorry or that must be hard or any of the things people usually said, which was either because she was unsentimental or because she understood those responses were inadequate. Do you like it? She asked instead. He thought about lying. It would have been easy. He'd gotten good at the abbreviated answers, the fine enough, and the can't complain that shut conversations down gently. Instead, he just stood there for a moment and looked out at the pasture, where 2 of his horses were standing with their backs to the wind, heads down. Some days, he said. She nodded as if that was a reasonable and complete answer. Thank you, she said, for the books and for the information about the damper. She almost smiled. I have not forgotten. She turned the mare back toward the road, and Gideon watched her go, and then turned back to the fence. His hands were less steady than they'd been before she arrived. He didn't think about what that meant. He refused to think about what that meant. November deepened. The temperature dropped into single digits on several nights, and the cattle required more attention, and Gideon's days got longer. He was up earlier, to bed later. He ate what was easy and fast and didn't particularly notice what it was. This was his life in November, had been for years, and the rhythm of it was familiar in a way that was almost comforting, in the way that anything familiar was comforting regardless of whether it was actually good for you. He thought about Eliza Rowan occasionally. He tried not to, and he was mostly successful because he was genuinely that busy and because he had built some fairly efficient internal systems for not thinking about things that led nowhere productive. But occasionally, the town continued to talk. He heard it in fragments from Henderson, who mentioned it once in passing, from old Carl Ryder, who was 81 and felt that his age entitled him to say things other people only thought, from the Garvey brothers, who ran the feed store and who were not subtle about anything. The shape of the gossip was essentially this: Gideon Ashcroft and the schoolteacher. Isn't that something? Well, wouldn't that be a thing? Clearwater was not a cruel town. It was a small one, which produced some of the same effects as cruelty, but was distinct from it. The people who discussed Gideon and Eliza, who discussed the idea of them, the abstract, weren't malicious exactly. They were just interested in the way people get interested in anything that doesn't fit neatly into the expected order. Because Gideon Ashcroft at 58 was not the expected order. He was a widower, established, set in ways that the town knew well. He was the man who showed up every few weeks, bought what he needed, didn't stay, went home. He wasn't romantic material in any conventional sense. He wasn't looking, wasn't seeking, hadn't been for so long that people had essentially stopped counting him in that category. He was, to the collective imagination of Clearwater, finished in a particular way. Not mean or bitter, just concluded, settled. And Eliza Rowan was young and new and had come from a city, and she asked questions and carried books everywhere and occasionally showed up at town gatherings. and talked to people with a directness that some found refreshing and some found alarming. She wasn't remarkable in any obvious way. She was just present, actively present, in a way that Clearwater wasn't entirely used to from its school teachers, most of whom had been quiet women content to do their work and not disturb the existing social arrangements. Eliza disturbed things, not intentionally, as far as anyone could tell, just by existing in the way she existed. The suitors noticed this because Clearwater had suitors, young men, mostly, in their 20s and early 30s, some of them ranchers' sons, and some of them working at the feed store or the livery or the mill. They had noticed Eliza within her first week. By the third week, there had been flowers left at the schoolhouse. By the fifth week, one of the Cartwright boys had asked her to accompany him to the November harvest dinner, and she had declined in a way that was polite but apparently not encouraging enough to entirely discourage him. Robert Cartwright was 24, blonde, good-looking in an angular, uncomplicated way, and his father owned 300 acres and a good water source, which made him arguably the most eligible unmarried man in the county. The fact that Eliza Rowan had not immediately recognized this as compelling information was a source of considerable puzzlement to the Cartwright family and to a significant portion of the town. Gideon heard about Robert Cartwright from Carl Ryder, who had the habit of delivering information to Gideon during the brief windows when Gideon was stationary enough to be caught. "Young Cartwright's got his eye on the school teacher," Carl said one morning, when Gideon was waiting for Henderson to locate a particular hinge mechanism he'd ordered. "Is that right?" Gideon said. "She turned him down for the harvest dinner. Don't know what she's thinking. Maybe she's thinking she doesn't want to go to a harvest dinner with Robert Cartwright." Carl looked at him with the expression of a man who was putting pieces together. "You met her," Carl said. "It was not a question." "Twice," Gideon said. "About a stove and some books." Carl said in a tone that contained considerably more than actually communicated. "Don't," Gideon said. "I wasn't saying anything. You were thinking it loud enough." Carl's smile was old and knowing and slightly insufferable. "A man's allowed to think." Henderson found the hinge. Gideon bought it and left. The third visit came in the last week of November, and this time she didn't pretend it was about anything specific. She knocked on his door on a Saturday afternoon when the light was already going flat and gray in the way it did in late November. That early darkness that felt like a small betrayal every time the season turned. He answered the door and found her standing on his porch with a book under her arm and an expression that was direct but not quite as unconcerned as she was working to make it look. "I was in the area," she said. He looked at her. His property was 3.5 miles from the nearest road that could be called a thoroughfare and 2 miles from the closest neighbor, and approximately nobody was in the area by accident. "You weren't," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, then, "No, I wasn't." She shifted the book under her arm. "I wanted to return this. You lent it to me last time." "I didn't lend you anything. You identified it. That felt like a kind of lending." She held the book out. It was the natural history volume from the Greer family. He took it more out of reflex than because he'd intended to. "May I come in?" she asked. "It's cold." It was cold. It was extremely cold. He stepped back from the door and she came inside. She stood in his front room and looked around with the careful, attentive expression of someone who is reading a space the way you'd read a page. The 2 chairs. The quilt. The books on the shelf. He had a fair number, more than most ranchers, because books had been one of the few things he'd never been able to talk himself out of buying. The fire burning in the stove. The general order of a place kept clean by habit rather than pride. "It's a good house," she said. She said it like she meant it, not like she was being polite. "Sit down if you want," he said, and moved into the kitchen to put water on for coffee, because it seemed like the thing to do and because it gave him somewhere to put himself. She sat in his chair. The other one, not the one with the quilt. He noticed this without knowing exactly what he felt about it. He made coffee and brought 2 cups into the sitting room and sat in his own chair, the one with the quilt on the arm, which he moved to the floor without particularly thinking about it. It sat on the floor between the chairs, and neither of them mentioned it. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "You can try," he said, which was what he'd said before, and she noticed it. "Do you miss her?" He went very still. "My wife," he said, not a question. "Yes." He looked at the fire for a long moment. "Every day," he said. "Less sharp now, but yes." What was she like? Nobody had asked him this in a long time. People asked how he was doing, how the ranch was, whether he'd thought about hiring on another hand. Nobody asked what Margaret had been like because Margaret had been gone for 11 years, and the living world had moved on in the way the living world does. "Stubborn," he said. "Funny. She had opinions about everything, and she wasn't shy about them." He paused. "She was better at people than I am." Eliza looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite name. "I doubt that's as true as you think," she said. "It's true." "You let me in." "You said it was cold." Plenty of men would have said that's too bad and closed the door. He didn't have an answer to that, so he drank his coffee. Outside, the wind had started to pick up, moving through the pines to the north with that low, serious sound that meant the temperature was going to drop considerably before morning. "Why did you really come?" he asked. Not unfriendly, just direct, because she had been direct with him, and it seemed fair to return the currency. She held her cup with both hands and thought about the question for a real moment. "Because you're the most honest person I've met since I got to Clearwater," she said finally. "And I'm not used to being in a place where I don't know anyone, and most people here are nice, but they're measuring me at the same time, figuring out where I fit. You don't do that." "I do," he said. "Differently, then." She looked down at her cup. "You look at me like I'm a person who might have something worth saying. It's a different feeling." Gideon thought about a number of things he could say. He thought about Margaret, who would have known exactly what to say, who had always known the right measure of honesty and warmth, and how to mix them. He thought about the quilt on the floor. He thought about the way Eliza had said the most honest person I've met without any apparent strategy behind it. "You should be careful," he said. She looked at him. Of what? He wasn't sure exactly what he meant by it. The town, maybe. Or him. Or herself. Or the particular kind of loneliness that made honesty feel like intimacy faster than it should. "Nothing," he said. "Never mind." They sat with the fire for another half hour, talking about smaller things. The winter, the cattle, the book on natural history, whether Montana was better or worse in the summer, which she hadn't seen yet. He told her the summer was short but fierce, that the wildflowers came up fast and the days ran long, and the light at 10 o'clock in the evening was something you didn't forget. He told her this without meaning to tell her more than he intended, and she listened without interrupting, which was something he had not realized he'd missed until he heard himself talking this much in one sitting. When she left, the dark had fully arrived and the temperature had dropped another several degrees. He watched her ride down the road toward town, the brown mare picking her way carefully through the cold, until the dark took them both. He stood on the porch for a minute longer than necessary. "She is 30 years old," he thought, "give or take, and you are 58, and this is not what you think it is." He went inside. He did not sleep particularly well, and in the morning, he didn't think about why. December arrived in Clearwater with a blizzard that came out of the northwest on a Tuesday night and deposited 14 inches of snow across the county in about 9 hours. Gideon spent the storm and the day following it keeping his cattle alive, which was a full-time occupation involving no breaks and no room for anything except the immediate problem of wind and cold and animals that needed to be gotten to shelter. He lost one calf, a small one he'd known wasn't going to be robust, and the rest made it through, which was about the best you could expect. He didn't get into town for 2 weeks after the blizzard, and when he did, Clearwater had the particular atmosphere of a place that had been housebound together long enough to have refined its opinions. Martha Hensley caught him within 5 minutes of his arrival. "She's been asking after you," Martha said, in a tone that was working hard at neutrality and missing it by a fair distance. Gideon did not stop walking. "Who has?" "You know who." Martha fell into step beside him with the ease of someone who had been doing this for years. "Twice she asked. Once at the post office. She wanted to know if you'd gotten caught in the storm, if anyone had heard. Once at Henderson's." He said nothing. "People noticed," Martha said. "People notice everything," Gideon said. Gideon. Something in her voice shifted, dropped the performing quality, became something more like actual concern. "Be careful." He stopped then and looked at her. Martha Hensley had known him for 20 years, had known Margaret, had been one of the women who'd brought food to his door in the weeks after Margaret died when he hadn't been eating properly. She wasn't his enemy. She wasn't even being unkind, exactly. "I know," he said. "I know," he said again, and moved on. He found himself at the schoolhouse without entirely meaning to go there. It was the middle of the afternoon, which meant lessons were still going. He could hear voices inside. The particular organized chaos of children working through something that required counting. He stood outside for a moment, feeling foolish, and then the door opened because one of the students was being sent on some errand and stopped dead at the sight of a large man standing on the porch. "Is your teacher inside?" Gideon asked the boy, 11 or 12, freckled, bundled in a coat 2 sizes large for him. "Yes, sir," the boy said. "Tell her Gideon Ashcroft is here when she has a minute." The boy disappeared back inside. Gideon waited. About 3 minutes later, Eliza appeared in the doorway, and the expression on her face when she saw him was something he had not expected and could not entirely catalog. Relief, maybe, and surprise, and something else that she pulled back before he could read it properly. "You're all right," she said. It came out flatter than she seemed to have intended. "I'm all right," he said. "Storm kept me busy. I heard there was livestock trouble out on the eastern properties." "Lost a calf. Nothing else." She nodded, and there was a pause, and through the schoolhouse door came the sound of 20 children attempting to go about their business with absolutely zero focus, probably because their teacher had stepped outside. "I have another hour," she said. "Can you wait?" He was aware that waiting an hour outside a schoolhouse in Clearwater for the new schoolteacher was not invisible behavior. He was aware that at least 4 people on the main street could see him standing there if they chose to look, and that at least 3 of those 4 would make note of it. "I'll wait," he said. She went back inside. He leaned against the porch post and listened to the children and watched the street and thought about how Margaret would have laughed at him for this. Not cruelly. Margaret had never been cruel. But she would have laughed, and she would have been right to laugh. And for the first time in a long time, he could imagine that laugh so clearly it almost didn't hurt. Almost. When Eliza came out an hour later carrying her coat and a satchel and with her hair slightly less ordered than before, they walked down the main street together, and people watched them do it, and they both knew people were watching them do it, and neither of them mentioned it. "Tell me about the ranch," she said. "What about it?" "What it's like. What you do all day." So he told her. He'd never actually told anyone this in any detail, because there'd never been anyone who asked in the way she asked, which was like she actually wanted to know, and wasn't just filling silence. He told her about the morning routine, the way the cattle needed checking before anything else, the particular attention required for the animals close to calving, the fence work, the way a good section of fence line could feel almost satisfying when you got it right, and the way a bad section could ruin 3 hours of a morning without warning. She listened and asked questions. Real questions, not the kind that signaled she was just waiting for her turn to talk. Why that breed of cattle? Do they handle the winters better? What do you do when a storm comes fast and the animals are in the lower pasture? He found himself answering at length. Found himself, somewhere in the middle of it, understanding that he had not talked this much to another person in, he couldn't say how long, years, more than a year certainly, maybe several. At the edge of town where the road split toward his property and toward the boarding house where she kept rooms, they stopped. The light was going. The cold had that clean, empty quality it got in December. "Thank you for coming in," she said. "I had supplies to get." "You came to the schoolhouse first." She said it without accusation. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment that ran just slightly longer than comfortable. "I'll see you, Miss Rowan," he said. "Eliza," she said. He looked at her. "My name is Eliza," she said. "Not Miss Rowan." He was quiet for a moment. "Eliza," he said, and it came out in a voice that was a little different from the one he'd been using all afternoon, and he couldn't have said why, and she appeared to hear the difference because her expression shifted slightly. Just slightly. "Gideon," she said, and turned toward her road. He turned toward his. The name sat in his chest the whole ride home, warm and still and slightly terrifying. The way something rare is when you've almost forgotten what rare feels like. He did not know what to do with this. He did not know what to do with any of it. But the quilt had been on the floor for 3 weeks now, and he hadn't picked it up. He noticed that. The quilt stayed on the floor for another week before Gideon picked it up. Not because he'd made a decision about it, but because one morning he nearly tripped over it in the dark at 4 a.m., and that seemed like a practical reason to move it. He folded it and put it on the shelf in the bedroom, on the top shelf where he kept things he didn't use but wasn't ready to throw away. Then he stood there for a moment looking at it and felt something he couldn't name and went outside to start his morning. That was how he handled most things that winter. Practical reasons. One task at a time. Don't look directly at the thing that's making your chest feel strange. Eliza Rowan had other ideas. She came back on a Wednesday in the second week of December, this time without the borrowed mare. She'd walked the 3.5 miles from Clearwater in boots that were adequate for town, but not built for that kind of distance in that kind of cold. She showed up at his door with her cheeks red and her breath coming in short, visible clouds, and snow packed into the seam where her boot met her leg. And when he opened the door and saw her standing there, he had approximately 3 seconds of pure, unguarded alarm before he got his face back under control. "You walked," he said. The livery was closed. She stamped her feet on the porch boards. "The mare had something wrong with her shoe, and Brennan wouldn't let me take her. It's 15 degrees. I'm aware of that." She was trying not to shiver and not entirely succeeding. "Are you going to let me in, or do you want to continue discussing the temperature?" He stepped back from the door. She came inside and stood near the stove and pulled her gloves off and held her hands toward the heat with the focused relief of someone who had been cold for long enough that warmth felt like a physical restoration. He watched her do this and then went to the kitchen and put the kettle on without asking, because it was 15 degrees and she'd walked 3.5 miles, and there was nothing to discuss about whether coffee was appropriate. "Why did you walk?" he asked from the kitchen. A pause. "I wanted to." He came back to the doorway. "You wanted to walk 3.5 miles in 15-degree weather." "I wanted to come out here. The walking was incidental." She looked at him over her shoulder, still turned toward the stove. "Is that strange?" He thought about the true answer to that question and chose a different one. "Sit down," he said, "before you fall down." She sat, and he made coffee, and the stove worked the way it was supposed to. And for a while they were just two people in a warm room, while outside the Montana December pressed against the windows and did its best to remind everything alive that it was out there. She'd brought something in her satchel. She always had something in her satchel. This time it was a set of papers, handwritten, that turned out to be her curriculum plans for the second half of the school year. She'd been reworking them, she said, because she wasn't happy with the reading selections. "These children are being given books that were written for children in Boston," she said, spreading the papers on the table with the unself-conscious ownership of someone making themselves at home in a place they've decided to be comfortable in. They've never been to Boston. Half of them have never been more than 20 miles from where they were born. Why should they care about stories set in drawing rooms and harbor towns? What would you give them instead? She looked at him. "That's what I've been trying to figure out. That's partly why I came." He turned this over. "You're asking me what to give Montana children to read. You grew up here. You read." She gestured at his bookshelf, which was more populated than she'd probably expected the first time she saw it. "You clearly read a lot. What do you wish someone had put in front of you when you were 10 years old?" Nobody had asked Gideon Ashcroft what he wished for in a very long time. The question sat in the room for a moment while he located an answer that wasn't reflexive. "Something true," he said finally. "Something that didn't pretend the world was cleaner than it is." She wrote that down. Actually wrote it down. On her papers, which he hadn't expected and which did something uncomfortable to the space behind his sternum. They talked about books for over an hour. Not in the way people talked about books to be impressive, not listing titles or demonstrating knowledge, but in the way people talked about books when they actually cared, which was messier and more personal, and sometimes ended up not being about books at all. She told him about a novel she'd read the previous winter that had made her cry on a streetcar in St. Paul and feel embarrassed about it. He told her about a book on animal behavior he'd read 3 times because there was something in it about the way horses perceived fear that he'd found genuinely revelatory. She said she had not expected that. He said he hadn't either, the first time. Outside, the light shifted and flattened, and she looked at the window and seemed to remember something. "I should go," she said, "before it gets dark." "You can't walk back," he said. "I walked out. The temperature's dropped since you got here. Another 5, maybe 6 degrees. He stood up. "I'll drive you." She opened her mouth to say something, probably to refuse, because she was the kind of person who found refusing easier than accepting, and then closed it again. "All right," she said. He hitched the smaller wagon, and they drove back toward Clearwater in the gathering dark, both of them bundled and neither of them talking much, because the cold had a way of making conversation feel expensive. The road was hard, and the horse's breath came out in rolling clouds that caught what was left of the light, and the pines on either side of the road had gone dark and still with cold. About halfway to town, out of nowhere, she said, "Do people talk about me? In town?" He thought about lying. "Yes," he said. "About us?" A beat. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "What do they say?" "Nothing specific, nothing mean." He watched the road. "Just talk." She pulled her coat tighter. "Robert Cartwright came to the schoolhouse last week," she said. "He brought flowers. He's done it twice now." Gideon kept his eyes on the horses. Something in his jaw tightened without his permission. "He's a decent enough young man," he said carefully. "He's 24 years old, and he talks about his father's land every 3 sentences," Eliza said, in a tone that was flat and final and left no room for further discussion of Robert Cartwright's merits. Gideon said nothing, because there was nothing he had the right to say. "Does it bother you?" she asked. "The talk." "It doesn't bother me for me," he said. "I've been talked about in that town for 20 years. But for me," she said quietly. He looked at her then, just briefly, taking his eyes off the road for a moment. Her face in the cold dark was serious and still, and she was looking at him in a way that was waiting for an honest answer. "Yes," he said. "It bothers me for you, for—" She nodded. She seemed to accept this in a different way than he'd meant it, or maybe in exactly the way he'd meant it, and he wasn't sure which was worse. When he dropped her at the boarding house, she climbed down and then turned and looked up at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said, "for the coffee, and for the drive, and for the conversation." "Don't walk out again," he said, "in this cold." "I'll try not to." Her mouth curved slightly. "But I make no promises." He drove home in the dark, and the cold was absolute, and he made himself think about the cattle and the fence on the north end that needed attention before the next storm, and whether he had enough salt lick to get through to March. He made himself think about practical things, about the ranch, about the list of tasks that would greet him at 4 a.m., the way they always did. He made himself not think about the way she'd said, "but for me," and the way he'd answered, and what that answer had actually said without him intending to say it. He was mostly successful. Mostly. The weeks before Christmas were busy in Clearwater in a way that disrupted the town's usual rhythms just enough to create friction. There were gatherings, a school recital that Eliza organized, which the whole town attended, and which was by all accounts a success, with children reciting passages and performing a brief theatrical piece that apparently made Agnes Whitmore cry, though Agnes Whitmore was known to cry at most things. There was a community dinner at the hall, hosted by the Vance family, who were the closest thing Grover County had to established money and who hosted the dinner every December with a kind of generous authority that was impossible to resent even if you noticed it. Gideon went to neither. He never went to town gatherings. It wasn't bitterness. It was simply that rooms full of people and noise and social obligation made him feel like a man wearing shoes on the wrong feet, uncomfortable in a way that was too small to complain about and too constant to ignore. But he heard about the school recital from Henderson, who told him Eliza had stayed to arrange chairs and clean the hall alone at the end because she'd sent all the children home when it got late. He heard about the community dinner from Carl Ryder, who told him with theatrical specificity that Robert Cartwright had spent the better part of the evening finding reasons to stand near Eliza, and that Eliza had spent the better part of the evening finding reasons to stand somewhere else. Carl delivered this information with the satisfaction of a man dropping a card he knows is good. Gideon said, "I don't see what that has to do with me." Carl said, "I know you don't. That's the problem." This was a conversation Gideon ended by walking away from it, which was his preferred method of ending conversations he didn't want to have. Eliza came to the ranch one more time before Christmas, and this time she didn't pretend it was an errand, didn't invent a book or a curriculum question or a student-related excuse. She simply appeared on a Saturday morning with a small wrapped package and the somewhat combative expression of someone prepared to be told they shouldn't have come. I brought you something, she said, holding out the package. For Christmas. Before you say anything. It's not much, and you're not obligated to feel anything about it. He took the package. It was a book. He could tell by the shape and weight. He didn't open it immediately, which seemed to surprise her. Thank you, he said. You haven't seen what it is. Doesn't matter. She looked at him for a moment, and something in her expression softened briefly before she reassembled it. May I come in? I won't stay long. He let her in, and she sat in her usual chair. It had become her chair in a way that he thought about sometimes in the mornings when he was drinking his coffee alone. And he put the coffee on, and they talked for an hour and a half, which was not a short time and was not what she'd said when she said she wouldn't stay long. He opened the book while she was there. It was a collection of essays on natural history, a newer one, recently published, with color plates of Western landscapes that were surprisingly accurate for something printed east of the Mississippi. It was exactly the kind of book he would have chosen for himself, which meant she had been paying attention in a way that was not casual. He looked at the book and then at her. How did you know? He said. She shrugged, but there was something careful in the shrug. You talk about the land when you're comfortable, she said, about what it does and how it works. I thought you might like someone else who talks about it that way. He set the book on the table and kept his hands on the cover for a moment longer than necessary. It's a good gift, he said. Good, she said, in a tone that was going for brisk and landing somewhere more complicated. After she left that afternoon, Gideon sat with the book in his lap for a long time without opening it. The fire burned steadily. Outside, the wind was picking up in the North Pines. He thought about Margaret, who had given him books too, who had understood early that books were the way to reach him, that you could tell him something through a book that he'd have defended himself against in conversation. He thought about the fact that Eliza Rowan had figured this out without being told. He thought about the fact that she was 30 years old, give or take, and that he was 58, and that these numbers were real numbers that did not change because he spent time not thinking about them. He thought about Robert Cartwright, 24 and blonde, with his father's 300 acres and his uncomplicated future ahead of him, standing near Eliza at a Christmas dinner while she found reasons to be somewhere else. He thought about what Carl Reiter had said, I know you don't. That's the problem. And the accuracy of it, which was infuriating. He didn't sleep well that night either, or the night after. January arrived without ceremony, the way it always did in Montana. January didn't announce itself. It just made everything harder than it had been in December and expected you to adjust. The temperature stayed below zero for 10 consecutive days after New Year's, the kind of stretch that tested equipment and animals and the endurance of anyone who had to be outside in it. Gideon's days contracted to the essential. Keep the animals alive, keep the pipes from freezing, keep the stove burning, eat when he remembered to, sleep when he could no longer function without it. Eliza sent a letter during the cold stretch, delivered by the boy who occasionally ran errands for the post office. A kid named Sam Deaver, who was 13 and seemed to regard his own existence as primarily a vessel for delivering other people's messages. The letter was 2 pages, written in the close, neat handwriting he'd learned to recognize, and it was about ordinary things. School had been canceled for 3 days during the worst of the cold. She'd been reading. She'd had a long conversation with the woman who ran the boarding house about whether Clearwater was going to get a telegraph line. She'd tried to bake bread and it had not gone well. At the end, almost as a footnote, she'd written, I hope you're managing out there. The cold out on the open properties must be worse than in town. Write back if you have the time and inclination, which I know are not the same thing for you. He read this last line 3 times. He wrote back. It took him 2 evenings because he wasn't accustomed to letters, because his handwriting was adequate rather than good, because he kept starting and stopping and crumpling the paper and starting again. The final version was 1 page and covered the cold snap, the cattle, the fact that a section of roof on the east side barn had needed emergency repair during the worst night, and a question about the bread. What had gone wrong with it, specifically, because bread failures were usually diagnosable? He did not write what he was thinking. He wrote around it, carefully, the way you'd fence around a piece of ground you weren't ready to do anything with yet. She wrote back within 4 days. She had overproofed the dough, she said. She'd let it go too long in a warm spot near the stove, and it had collapsed on itself. She'd thrown it out and felt unreasonably angry about it, and had eaten cold ham for dinner instead, which she described as a personal low point for the winter. He read this and found himself doing something that had become unusual enough to startle him. He laughed. Alone in his kitchen at 4:30 in the afternoon, with the winter pressing in from all sides and the cattle needing to be checked and a barn roof that was still not fully right, he laughed, brief and quiet, at a woman who'd been defeated by bread dough and was honest enough to say so. The letters continued through January and into February. One a week, sometimes two, crossing paths on the road between the ranch and town because they were both writing before they'd received the other's last. The content was nothing dramatic, daily life, observations, small arguments about things that didn't matter, like whether the natural history essays he'd received for Christmas were accurate about elk behavior, which Eliza had strong opinions about despite having been in Montana for less than 5 months and having never seen an elk. He told her this. She told him that the author's argument was structurally sound regardless of her personal elk exposure, and he found himself genuinely enjoying the argument in a way that surprised him. But he knew, with the part of him that was honest even when honesty was inconvenient, that the letters were becoming something, that they occupied a space in his days that hadn't been there before, that he looked forward to Sam Deaver appearing on the road with the same attention he'd once given to watching the weather. He knew this, and he did not talk himself out of knowing it, but he also did not act on it, because acting on it would require him to acknowledge what it was, and acknowledgement would require him to hold it up against all the reasons it was wrong, and he wasn't ready to do either. It was Carl Ryder, inevitably, who forced his hand. It happened in February, on a day Gideon had come in for a specific set of supplies and had made the mistake of stopping at the Flint and Spur for a cup of coffee, where Carl was occupying his usual position at the end of the bar with the confidence of a man who has nowhere in particular to be and considers this a form of wisdom. Cartwright made her another offer, Carl said, without preamble. Took her to dinner at the hotel dining room. Made quite a production of it. Gideon set his cup down. When? Last Saturday. Carl watched him. She didn't turn him down this time. Not exactly. Something in Gideon's chest went very cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. What does not exactly mean? He said. Means she didn't say yes either. She told him she needed to think about it. Carl paused. Which people are taking as a yes that hasn't finished arriving yet? Gideon said nothing. He looked at his coffee cup and thought about Robert Cartwright, 24, with his angles and his father's land and his uncomplicated future, taking Eliza to the hotel dining room and making a production of it. He thought about Eliza saying she needed to think about it, which was either exactly what it sounded like or was nothing like what it sounded like, and he had no way to know which. She sent you a letter yesterday, Carl said. I saw Sam Deaver heading out toward your property. Gideon had received the letter. He'd read it twice. It had said nothing about Robert Cartwright or hotel dinners. You read other people's letters? He said. I don't read them. I notice them. Carl's expression shifted from interested to something more direct. Gideon, what are you doing? Having coffee. That's not what I mean. Gideon looked at him. Carl Ryder was 81 and had been married for 54 years before his wife had died, and he had the particular gravity of a man who had paid attention to his own life and other people's and drawn conclusions from both. I'm doing nothing, Gideon said. That's exactly what I'm asking you about, Carl said. Gideon left the money for his coffee on the bar and picked up his coat. She's 30 years old, he said, and he said it the way you say something you've been rehearsing. Too flat, too measured. Carl looked at him with an expression that was not unkind but was not merciful either. And you're 58, he said. I know. I also know that the last time you had a letter from her, you read it in Henderson's doorway and you forgot your change. Gideon had no answer for this that wasn't either a lie or an admission of something he was not ready to admit. So he put on his coat and walked out, and the cold hit him in the face like a flat hand, and he stood on the porch of the Flint and Spur for a moment before climbing up to his wagon. He sat there without moving for a little while. The street was quiet. A horse at the rail outside Henderson's, 2 women crossing toward the post office. The bell tower on the schoolhouse still leaning, still unaddressed by the town council, probably never going to be addressed by the town council. He thought about Robert Cartwright's dinner. He thought about she needed to think about it. He thought about a woman who had walked 3.5 miles in 15-degree weather because she wanted to, and who wrote him letters about bread dough and elk behavior and the structural soundness of arguments she had no personal evidence for. He thought about what it would mean to do nothing, to keep doing nothing specifically, to let the weeks go by and the letters continue and the season turn and Robert Cartwright's dinner become a series of dinners and then something more, while Gideon Ashcroft drove his wagon back to his ranch and sat in his chair across from an empty one and told himself he was being reasonable, he was being honorable, he was doing what a man his age ought to do. He didn't move the wagon for a long time. When he finally did, he turned toward the ranch, the way he always did. The decision he hadn't made sat with him the whole way home, heavy and unresolved, the way the wrong choice tends to sit when you're trying to convince yourself it's the right one. That night he sat with the natural history book she'd given him for Christmas and didn't read a single page of it. The fire burned down further than he usually let it. The wind was doing something complicated outside, shifting directions every hour or so, which usually meant weather coming. He thought, with a clarity that surprised him with its sharpness, if she marries Robert Cartwright, it will be the right outcome. It will be the reasonable outcome. She'll have what she deserves, someone her age, a future without arithmetic, a life that fits the shape of what people expect when they look at a young woman. He thought, that is what you should want for her. He thought, it is not what you want. And those two things sat across from each other in the quiet of the ranch house, and neither one yielded to the other. And the fire burned low, and outside the snow that the wind had been promising all evening finally started to fall. The snow that started falling that night didn't stop for 2 days. Gideon worked through both of them without pause, the way the ranch demanded, the way he'd trained himself to work when the weather made everything urgent and personal considerations became a luxury he couldn't afford. There was a logic to crisis that he'd always found almost restful. When survival was the priority, everything else simplified. You didn't have to decide what mattered. The cold decided for you. By the time the storm cleared and the sky went back to that hard pale blue that Montana wore after a big snow, he'd lost another calf, fixed a section of collapsed fence on the south pasture, and slept a combined total of about 9 hours across 48. He was bone-tired in the specific way of a man who is too old to recover as fast as the work required, though he would not have said this out loud to anyone. He didn't write to Eliza for 12 days after Carl's conversation at the Flint and Spur. He told himself it was because he was busy, which was true, and because he didn't know what to say, which was truer. He received one letter from her during that stretch, about a student who had showed unexpected aptitude for arithmetic, about a book she'd finished and found disappointing, about the boarding house cat who had adopted the habit of sitting on her lesson plans. She didn't mention Robert Cartwright. She didn't mention the hotel dinner. She wrote as though everything was exactly as it had been, which was either because it was, or because she was giving him a version of events that was easier for both of them. He read the letter 4 times over 2 days, the way you read something when you're looking for what isn't there. When he finally wrote back, it was a short letter, shorter than usual. He wrote about the storm, the calves, the fence. At the end, without planning to, he wrote, I heard you had dinner at the hotel. Then he stared at that line for a long time and crossed it out so thoroughly it was unreadable and sealed the letter before he could second-guess the rest of it. Sam Deaver brought her response 6 days later, and Sam, who was 13 and observant in the way that children are when adults consistently underestimate them, handed Gideon the letter with an expression that was working hard to be neutral. She wrote it the same day she got yours, Sam said. She was at the post office when I went in. Thank you, Sam, Gideon said, in a tone that was a door closing politely. Sam took the hint and left. The letter was 3 pages, which was longer than her usual. She wrote about the arithmetic student again, a different angle on the same kid, something he'd said that had made her rethink how she'd been approaching the upper grades. She wrote about the boarding house cat. She wrote 2 full paragraphs about a disagreement she'd had with the town council about the school's coal supply, which she'd won, and she described winning it with a satisfaction that was entirely unladylike, and which she appeared to feel no need to apologize for. At the end, on the 3rd page, almost like an afterthought, she wrote, People tell me things they think I should know. I imagine they tell you the same. I want you to know that the things they're probably telling you are not the full version of anything. He read this paragraph many more times than the rest of the letter. He thought about writing back and asking what the full version was. He thought about this for 3 days. He did not write back and ask, because asking would be a kind of statement, and he was not ready to make that statement, and he was not sure he would ever be ready. And this was the central problem that sat in his chest like a stone that had been there long enough to start feeling permanent. March came in like the territory was trying to kill it. 2 more storms, one of them significant, and then a stretch of gray cold that didn't quite reach the brutality of January, but had a particular quality that was, in its way, harder. At least in January you were braced for it. March felt like broken promises. Gideon came into town on a Tuesday in mid-March for supplies and found himself, almost against his will, walking toward the schoolhouse at a time when he knew classes would be over. He told himself he was just going to Henderson's and then back. He told himself this with the conviction of a man who knew he was lying. The schoolhouse was empty when he arrived, or appeared to be. The door was unlocked, which he'd learned was how she left it. He pushed it open and found the room dim and cold. The stove burned down to coals, and Eliza at her desk in her coat with a stack of papers and a lamp, grating in the near dark with the focused, slightly grim expression of someone doing a task that needed doing and wasn't particularly enjoyable. She looked up when he came in. "The stove's low," he said. "I know, I was going to let it die." She set her pen down. "I'm almost done." He crossed to the stove anyway and fed it 2 pieces of coal from the scuttle beside it, because a room at 40 degrees was not a room anyone should be working in, and he couldn't stand the sight of it. She watched him do this without comment. He sat down in one of the student chairs, too small for him, always too small, his knees coming up wrong, and waited. She worked for another 10 minutes, marking papers with the same directness she applied to everything. He watched her without pretending not to. The lamplight did something to her face that the gray outdoor light didn't, made it more itself somehow, stripped of the social performance that even she, who performed less than most, still maintained in public. "You didn't write for a while," she said, without looking up from her papers. "I was busy." "I know. And then you were less busy and still didn't write." He said nothing. She finished the last paper and stacked them and put them in her satchel, and then looked at him directly, the way she did when she was going to say something she'd decided to say. "What did Carl Ryder tell you?" she said. He felt something tighten in his expression and knew she saw it. "What makes you think it was Carl?" "Because Carl tells everyone things and thinks he's being subtle, and he's been watching you for months like you're a problem he's trying to solve." She folded her hands on the desk. "What did he say?" "That Cartwright took you to dinner." "He did." "And that you didn't say no." She held his eyes. "I said I needed to think about it." "That's what Carl said." "And you spent, 2 weeks deciding what to do with that information?" There was an edge in her voice. Not anger exactly, but something that had been waiting to be said and was tired of waiting. "Eliza," he started. "Don't," she said. "Don't say something careful. I'm very tired of careful." He sat with that for a moment. The stove was beginning to put out some actual heat, and the light from the lamp was steady, and outside the sky was doing that end-of-afternoon thing where it couldn't decide between dark and darker. "What do you want me to say?" he asked. "I want you to say what you're actually thinking, not the version you've decided is appropriate." He looked at his hands on his knees. Large hands, weathered, the hands of a man who'd been using them hard for 40 years. He thought about appropriate. He thought about what he was actually thinking, and how long the list was, and how little of it he'd said out loud to anyone, and how much of it he had no right to say. "You're 30 years old," he said. "I'm aware of my age. I'm 58. I can also do subtraction. Then I know what you're going to say." Her voice was flat now. Not cold, but firm. "I've been waiting for you to say it since December. You're going to tell me the arithmetic doesn't work, that I should be with someone my own age, that you'd be taking something from me that I deserve to have with someone else." She paused. "Is that about right?" He looked at her. "It's not wrong. It's not your decision." "Eliza, no." She stood up. Not in anger, or not only in anger, in the way people stand when they need to say something standing, because sitting doesn't give it enough weight. "You don't get to make that calculation for me. You don't get to decide what I deserve and then act on the decision without asking me." He stood too because they'd always talked better on equal footing, and because something in the way she was standing made him feel like he should meet it. "I'm trying to be honest," he said. "You're trying to be noble. There's a difference." She crossed her arms, not defensively, but as though she needed somewhere to put her hands. Noble is telling yourself a story about sacrifice that lets you off the hook for being afraid. This landed harder than anything Carl had said because it was more accurate. What do you want from me? He said. It came out rougher than he intended. I want you to stop acting like you're doing me a favor by disappearing. They stood there in the schoolroom with the lamp between them and the stove beginning to tick with heat, and outside the first dark coming in, and he could feel something pressing against the inside of his chest that he'd been keeping pressed back for months. I'm 58 years old, he said again, but this time it came out differently. Not as an argument, but almost as a confession. I know, she said, quietly, now. The edge had gone. I know exactly how old you are. I've known since January. And Cartwright is 24 and pleasant and completely without anything that I actually care about. She said it with a weariness that was genuine. I said I needed to think about it because I was trying to be kind, and because I didn't know how to explain that the reason I couldn't say yes wasn't about him at all. He heard what she didn't say in that sentence. He heard it very clearly. He looked at her for a long time, standing in that cold schoolroom that he had now been in many times, in this chair he was too big for, at this woman who had walked 3 miles in 15 degrees because she wanted to, and who wrote him letters about elk and bread, and who had given him a book she had never told him how she found. I don't know how to do this, he said. I don't either, she said. But not knowing how isn't the same as it being impossible. He picked up his coat from the chair where he'd laid it. She waited. Outside, the wind was doing something restless. Walk with me, he said. She looked surprised. Now? It's not dark yet. She took her coat and her satchel, and they walked out of the schoolhouse into the cold late afternoon, down the main street of Clearwater, and then past the edge of town, toward the open land that started where the last fences did, and ran north toward the Ashcroft property 3.5 miles away. They walked without destination, which was unusual for both of them, and they didn't talk immediately, which was also unusual. The ground was hard. Their breath made white clouds and dispersed. Tell me about the engagement, he said. She didn't ask how he knew. His name was Franklin Gould. He was a lawyer in St. Paul, from a good family. We'd known each other 2 years. Everyone thought it was right, settled. My mother cried, but in the happy way. She paused, watching the ground ahead of her. And I liked him. He was decent and intelligent, and I thought decent and intelligent was enough. What changed? I went to a dinner party one evening, she said, and I sat across from a woman who was exactly who I would be in 20 years if I married Franklin Gould. Same house, same conversations, same carefully managed life, and she wasn't unhappy. That was the thing. She wasn't unhappy at all. She just stopped. Somewhere along the way, she'd stopped wanting anything that she hadn't already arranged. He walked beside her and listened. I broke off the engagement 3 weeks later, she said. My father didn't speak to me for 2 months. My mother spoke to me too much, which was almost worse. She glanced at him. I came to Montana because it was as far from arranged as I could manage on a teacher's income. And then you ended up talking to the most solitary man in Grover County. She laughed. That real laugh. The one that wasn't polite. As it turns out, they had reached the eastern fence line of the Greer property, which marked approximately the edge of where it was sensible to walk in the darkening afternoon. They stopped there. Beyond the fence, the land ran flat and snow-covered toward the tree line, already in shadow. Gideon looked out at it. The light was going the way it did in Montana in March, fast, with commitment. I have 11 years behind me, he said, of nothing. I don't know what I am anymore exactly, on the other side of that. You're the man who drives me home in the cold, she said, who reads Latin and knows about dampers and remembers what I tell him and argues about elk with me for 3 weeks by mail. That's not a full inventory. No, she said, but it's the inventory I care about. He looked at her. She was looking at him with the directness she always had, the looking without flinching that he'd noticed the very first morning in the schoolhouse, when she'd been crouched in front of a stove that didn't work and had looked up at him without startling. The town will talk, he said. The town is already talking. Worse than now. Probably. She held his eyes. Are you asking if that changes my thinking? He didn't answer, because that wasn't quite what he was asking. It doesn't, she said, in case you're wondering. He turned back to the fence. The The top rail had been poorly set and had a slight bow in it that he noticed the way he always noticed things that needed fixing. He thought about what he was about to say, and thought about not saying it, and thought about the conversation he'd had with himself all winter long, and how none of it had resolved into anything except a man getting older in a house by himself, while someone worth knowing drove away on borrowed horses. "I don't know how to promise you easy," he said. "The ranch is hard, the winters are hard. I'm not—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not a young man, and that means things. I don't say that to talk you out of anything. I say it because it's true, and because you're the kind of person who deserves the truth of it up front." "I didn't come to Montana for easy," she said. "I know. And I didn't walk out to your ranch 3 times in December because I was bored. I know that too." "Then what is it?" she said, and there was something suddenly raw in her voice. Not anger this time, something more unguarded than that. "What is it that you're still holding back from?" He was quiet for a long moment, and the quiet wasn't comfortable, wasn't the comfortable silence they'd built between them over months of coffee and letters. It was the silence of a man at the edge of something real, deciding whether to step. "I'm afraid," he said. He said it simply, without dressing it up, because she'd told him she was tired of careful, and he thought she deserved the least decorated version of the truth. "I had something, and I lost it, and I put myself away after that. And I've forgotten how to hold something that could go wrong again." She was very still. "I know," she said, after a moment, quietly. "I know that's real. I'm not asking you to not feel it." "Then what are you asking?" She turned toward him, and the light was almost gone now, and the cold was deepening the way it did when the sun gave up entirely, and she looked at him the way she had from the very beginning, without performing anything, without managing her face into something more comfortable or palatable or socially appropriate. "I'm asking you to feel it and do this anyway," she said. He looked at her for a long time. The fence rail between them had that bow in it, slightly wrong, needing to be reset. He thought about it briefly and then stopped thinking about it because there are moments when the broken thing in your immediate field of vision is not the important thing, and you have to make yourself understand that. "I don't know what comes next," he said. "Neither do I." She didn't look away. "But I'm not asking for a map. I'm just asking you to decide." He reached up and put his hand on the fence rail, not reaching for her, just grounding himself, the habit of a man who needed something solid when the world felt uncertain. The wood was cold and rough under his palm, real and immediate and fixed. "Robert Cartwright," he said. "You should give him an answer." Her eyes stayed on him. "I'm planning to." "What will you tell him?" "That depends," she said steadily, "on what you decide." He stood there at the fence at the edge of Greer's property in the last light of a March afternoon in Montana, with the cold coming in hard from the north, and the snow stretched out flat and white in every direction, and a woman waiting for him to be braver than he'd been in 11 years. He thought about Margaret. He thought about what Margaret would say. Not the sentimental version, not the version where grief makes the dead into saints who say exactly what you need to hear. He thought about the real Margaret, the stubborn one, the funny one, the one who had opinions about everything. The one who had once told him, during a particularly bad winter early in their marriage, that the only thing she couldn't forgive in a man was cowardice, because cowardice was the one choice you made fresh every single day. He thought about the quilt on the shelf in the bedroom. He thought about 12 days of not writing, and the stone in his chest, and the way her letter had said the things they're probably telling you are not the full version of anything. "I need time," he said. Not a refusal, not an argument, just the truth. She studied his face for a moment, reading it the way she read everything. "All right," she said, "a few days." "All right. Not because I'm—" He stopped. Tried again. "Not because I don't—" "Gideon." She said his name the way she'd said it the first time she used it. That first time at the crossroads, quiet and deliberate. "I know." He believed her. That was the thing. He actually believed that she knew, which was either the most reasonable or the most terrifying thing that had happened to him in a decade, and he couldn't currently tell the difference between those two options. They walked back toward town in the dark, not touching, the cold absolute around them. At the edge of the main street, they stopped again, the way they always stopped at the place where the roads divided. Go home, she said. Think. Take your few days. And Cartwright? I'll manage Robert Cartwright, she said, in a tone that closed the subject with efficiency. He nodded. She walked toward the boarding house. He stood there for a moment and watched her, and then he turned toward where he'd left the wagon and unhitched the horses and climbed up and started north. The ride home was long and dark and very cold, and his own company was not particularly restful company that night. He thought about what she'd said. Feel it and do this anyway. And the way she'd said it, which was not a plea and not a demand, just a statement of what she was asking for, clear and unadorned. He thought about the fence rail with the bow in it, slightly wrong. He thought about how the first instinct was always to reach for the thing that needed fixing, to put your hand on it and get it right. By the time he reached the ranch and got the horses settled and came inside to the house that had been quiet for 11 years, he had not made any decision that he would have been able to write down and hand to another person. But something had shifted in the way a thing shifts when it's been held too long in one position and finally moves. Not dramatically, not cleanly, but with the kind of deep, settling movement that you feel more than you see. He made a cup of coffee he didn't drink and sat in his chair and looked at the fire and thought about courage as a daily practice. And eventually, very late, he went to bed. He did not sleep for a long time. But when he finally did, he did not dream about anything cold. He gave himself 3 days, the way he'd said. He worked through them the same as any other days. Cattle, fences, the barn roof that still needed attention on the north end, the accumulation of small necessary tasks that made up a life on 420 acres. He worked and he thought, which for Gideon had always been the same activity because his mind operated better when his hands were occupied and the body had something real to push against. On the first day, he thought about the practical things, because that was where he always started. The ranch was a working property, not a showpiece, and it demanded a particular kind of woman to live on it, not someone who needed comfort or convenience or the social life of a town. He had thought about this honestly, without flattering himself or diminishing her. Eliza Rowan had come from a city. She had come from parlors and streetcars and a life that had things like dinner parties and lawyers from good families. Montana had surprised her. He could see that it had, in the way she still sometimes looked at the landscape like it was doing something unexpected. But being surprised by a place was not the same as being suited to it, except that she had walked 3.5 miles in 15 degrees because she wanted to, except that she had sat in his house and asked him real questions, and not performed discomfort at the rough edges of frontier life, except that she had fought the town council about coal and won, and described winning it with the satisfaction of someone who found that kind of fight natural rather than exhausting. He turned this over on the first day and arrived at no conclusion except that she was not who he'd been afraid she was. On the second day he thought about time, which was the harder territory. Not the arithmetic of their ages, he'd done that arithmetic so many times it had worn grooves. But the real question underneath it, the one he'd been circling for months. He was 58. In 10 years he would be 68, and in 10 years she would be 40. And what that meant in practical terms was that she would spend decades of her life with a man who was aging faster than she was, who would slow before she slowed, who would need things before she needed them. He had watched this happen to other couples with larger age gaps. It was not always hard, but it was never nothing. He sat with this on the second evening, in his chair, with the fire lower than usual because he'd been thinking instead of tending it. He thought about Margaret, not the grief of it this time, but the arithmetic of that too. They'd had 19 years. He'd been 30 when they married, she'd been 27, and they'd had 19 years before the fever took her in the spring of 76, and for most of those 19 years he had not once thought about how much time was left. You didn't, you just had the days you had, and you used them. He thought, if I have 10 good years with her, and then 10 harder ones, that is still 20 years I would not otherwise have had. He thought, she knows that. She's not a child. She looked at the arithmetic the same as I did, and she's still standing at the fence asking me to decide. He thought about cowardice as a daily practice. On the third morning, before dawn, he went to the bedroom and took the small box from the back of the top dresser drawer where it had been for 11 years. Margaret's ring was inside. A simple gold band with a small setting, nothing elaborate, bought in Billings in 1861 when he'd had almost no money and considerable nerve. Margaret had worn it every day of their 19 years together. He'd taken it off her hand himself, in the end, and put it in this box and put the box in this drawer, and had not opened it since. He opened it now. The ring was exactly as he'd left it. He held it in his palm under the lamp and looked at it for a long time. It was not a new ring. It was not a ring that came without history. Giving it would mean giving everything that came with it, the grief and the years and the man he'd been through all of it. And he thought a person had the right to know that before they accepted it. He thought Eliza Rowan would understand this better than most. He closed the box and put it in his coat pocket. He did not let himself think any further ahead than the next hour, because thinking further ahead would give the fear enough room to reorganize. And he'd spent 11 years letting the fear have that room, and he knew exactly where it led. He hitched the wagon as the sky was going from black to the particular dark blue that preceded dawn in Montana, loaded nothing into it because he had no supplies to pick up and no errand to pretend at, and drove toward Clearwater. It was a Saturday. The town was not quiet on Saturdays. There were people at the general store and at the feed store and at the post office, and the particular weekend movement of a small frontier community that used the one day with slightly more flexibility for everything that hadn't gotten done during the week. He drove down the main street without trying to be invisible, because invisibility was no longer the point and possibly had never been. He was aware of people noticing him. He was aware of Martha Hensley visible through the window of Henderson's, watching. He was aware of the Garvey brothers outside the feed store, talking, who stopped talking when he drove past. He had lived in this town for 30 years and had never much cared what it made of him, but this morning he felt its attention in a way that was different. Not threatening, just very present, like standing in a field when a storm is coming and feeling the air change. He tied the horses at the rail outside the boarding house. It was just past 7 in the morning, which was early for a Saturday visit, and he was aware of that too. He knocked on the front door, and the landlady, a large, practical woman named Mrs. Corbett, who ran her house with the efficiency of someone who had seen most of what people could do and had stopped being surprised by it, opened the door and looked at him. "Mr. Ashcroft," she said. "Morning. I'd like to speak to Miss Rowan, if she's up." Mrs. Corbett looked at him with an expression that was reading the situation accurately and making no editorial comment on it, which was one of the things that made her a good landlady. "She's in the dining room," she said, and stepped back to let him in. Eliza was at the dining room table with coffee and a book, still in her morning clothes, which was a dark wool dress that she wore around the house rather than the more assembled version she wore to school. Her hair was only partially arranged. She looked up when he came through the doorway, and the expression on her face moved through 3 things quickly. Surprise, something more complicated than surprise, and then a careful settling into stillness. "Gideon," she said. "I know it's early," he said. "It's all right." She closed the book. "Sit down." He sat, which put them at the same table in the low morning light with their coffee, or hers, because he hadn't been offered any yet and hadn't thought to ask. The dining room was empty except for them. Somewhere in the back of the house, Mrs. Corbett was being deliberately audible in the kitchen in a way that was designed to signal she was not listening. He reached into his coat pocket and set the small box on the table between them. She looked at it, then at him. "That's fast," she said. "I told you a few days." "You did." She didn't reach for it. "You want to tell me what you're thinking first, or—" "Let me say it in order," he said, "or I'll lose the thread." She folded her hands on the table, and he recognized this. It was what she did when she was paying full attention and didn't want her hands to do anything that might distract from it. "I've been alone for 11 years, he said. "Not all of it was bad. Some of it was the only way I knew how to get through what I needed to get through. But some of it was just—" He paused. "I made a habit of not wanting things. Because not wanting things is easier than wanting them and finding out you can't keep them." She was very still. "You walked into the school in November and the damper was closed," he said, and she made a sound that was almost a laugh, but wasn't quite yet. "And I told myself it was nothing. And then you came out to the property about books, and I told myself it was nothing. And every time I told myself it was nothing, I was lying. And I knew I was lying, and I kept doing it because the other option required me to admit something I wasn't ready for." "What were you not ready for?" she asked quietly. "That I still had this in me," he said. He said it simply, without decorating it. "I thought I was past it. I thought I'd used up whatever part of a person that is. And the idea that I hadn't—" He stopped. "It was easier to pretend I had. She looked at him with the expression he'd come to understand meant she was about to say something real. "You haven't," she said. "In case you needed someone to confirm that." "I noticed," he said, and something in his face shifted that he didn't try to prevent. "Eliza." He put his hand near the box without touching it. "This was Margaret's. I want you to know that before anything else. It's not a new thing. It comes with 11 years of history and everything that means. And if that's not... If you want something without that attached to it, I would understand. I would get something else." She looked at the box and then at him. "Can I see it?" she said. He opened the box and set it in front of her. The ring sat in the worn velvet interior, small and plain and real, the gold worn smooth in the places where Margaret's hand had touched things for 19 years. Eliza looked at it for a long moment. She reached out and touched the edge of the box, but didn't take the ring out. "You loved her very much," she said. "Yes." "And you still do." "Yes, that doesn't... It's not the same shelf. It doesn't take up the space you'd be in." She looked up at him. "I know that." She said it without any trace of jealousy or complication, which was either the most generous thing or the most honest thing, or both. "I wouldn't want you to be a man who stopped loving someone just because she died. That would tell me something about what kind of man you were." He sat with that. "Marry me," he said. He said it plainly, the way he did most things, without theater, without getting down on one knee because his knees were 58 years old and the floor of Mrs. Corbett's dining room was not the place. "I'm not going to tell you it'll be easy, because I already told you I can't promise easy. But I'll be honest with you. I'll work hard. He stopped. "I don't have a speech." "I don't want a speech," she said. "I'm aware of that. You've made that fairly clear." She looked at him, and the morning light was coming in through the window at the particular angle it did in mid-March, pale and slanted, and the coffee was getting cold on the table between them, and somewhere behind the wall Mrs. Corbett was maintaining the fiction of not listening with considerable effort. "Yes," Eliza said. He looked at her. "Yes," she said again, more simply, as if the first one had been for the room and this one was just for him. He picked up the ring from the box, and she held out her left hand with the steadiness of someone who had made her decision weeks ago and was only now arriving at the confirmation of it. He put the ring on her finger, and it fit well enough. Not perfectly, because it had been sized for Margaret's hand, and Eliza's was slightly different, but it sat there with a solidity that felt right in a way he hadn't been prepared for. He looked at it on her hand, and he felt something move in his chest that he recognized and didn't try to name. She looked at it too, and then at him. "The town is going to have a great deal to say," she said. "The town always has a great deal to say. Martha Hensley is going to find out about this within the hour, regardless of what we do," he said, "because that is the nature of Martha Hensley." She laughed, the real one, the full one, and the sound of it in the early morning dining room was the best thing he'd heard in a long time, possibly years, and he let himself know that without immediately hedging it with something more cautious. Mrs. Corbett appeared in the doorway with a second cup of coffee and the practiced neutrality of a woman who would take this particular piece of information to her grave, except that she absolutely would not. "Coffee, Mr. Ashcroft?" she said. "Thank you," he said. She set it down and went back to the kitchen, and there was the sound of considerable activity with pots that didn't strictly need the attention they were getting. Eliza looked at her hand on the table, the ring catching the light. "I should tell you something," she said. "What?" "I wrote to my mother 2 weeks ago. Not about you specifically, about the general situation." She paused. She wrote back and asked if I had lost my mind again. "What did you tell her?" "That I was still deciding." She looked at him. "I'll have to write her again." "What will you say?" She thought about it for a moment, actually considered it the way she considered things. "I'll tell her I found someone who reads Latin and argues in good faith and drives people home in the cold and doesn't say things he doesn't mean." She paused. "And that he's 58, and she's going to have strong opinions about that, and I'd like her to keep them mostly to herself." "She won't keep them to herself." "Absolutely not," Eliza agreed, "but it's polite to ask." He drank the coffee Mrs. Corbett had brought, which was better than his own, a fact he filed away as one of the many adjustments that were coming. They sat at the table for another half hour, talking about practical things now, because the decision had been made and practical things were what followed decisions in real life. The school, and whether she would continue teaching after the wedding. The ranch, and what it would mean for her to live 3.5 miles from town. Her things at the boarding house, which were not extensive but would need moving. His house, which had room enough but would need a woman's eye on it to become something other than a place a man kept himself alive in. The chair, he said. She looked at him. There are 2 chairs in the sitting room, he said. I want you to know. The quilt that was on one of them is on the shelf now. It's not... He considered how to say this. I'm not asking you to come into a house where everything's a monument to someone else. She was quiet for a moment. You can keep the quilt on the shelf, she said. I don't need you to put it away. I just need the chair. He looked at her. The chair, he said, is yours. They walked out of the boarding house into the March morning together, which was in itself a statement that required no verbal accompaniment. The street was awake. People were moving. And when Gideon Ashcroft and Eliza Rowan walked out of Mrs. Corbett's front door side by side and stood on the porch in the pale March light, the collective attention of Clearwater registered it the way a field registers a change in wind, all at once and completely. Martha Hensley was across the street. She saw them. Her face did several things in rapid succession. Gideon looked at her and nodded, the way he nodded at people in town, the same nod he'd given for 30 years. Not unfriendly, not performing anything, just acknowledgement. Then he looked back at Eliza. I have to get back to the cattle, he said. I know, she said. I'll come in Wednesday. We should talk to Reverend... He stopped, reconsidered. We should talk to someone about the arrangements. Wednesday, she said. I'll be at the school until 4. I'll find you. She looked at him, and the ring was on her hand and the morning light was on both of them. And neither of them said anything particularly significant about any of it, because the significant thing had already been said back in the dining room, with 2 words and a ring that fit nearly right. He climbed up to his wagon. She stood on the porch. Gideon, she said. He looked back. Tell the cattle I said hello, she said. He felt something in his face that he didn't try to prevent. I'll pass it along, he said, and turned the horses north toward the ranch. Behind him, he did not look back to see Martha Hensley already in motion toward Henderson's, though he knew she was. He didn't look back to see Eliza still standing on the porch, though he had the feeling she was. He just drove, with the March sun beginning to put something that was almost warmth on his shoulders, and the horses knowing the way home, the way they always did, and the empty wagon behind him that was going to mean something different very soon. The ring box was still in his coat pocket. He'd forgotten to leave it. He thought he'd give it to her on Wednesday. He thought about Wednesday with a feeling that was unfamiliar in its warmth, and he let himself feel it for exactly as long as it took to drive out of sight of Clearwater. And then he made himself think about the cattle again, because the cattle needed thinking about, and because some things were better held quietly rather than examined too closely in the early stages. But the feeling stayed. That was the thing he hadn't expected. It stayed the whole ride home. The wedding was on a Saturday in late April, when the snow had finally retreated to the high elevations and the lower pastures had gone from white to the particular brown-gray of ground that was deciding whether to produce anything this year. It was not warm. April in Montana was never warm in any sense a person from somewhere else would recognize. But the sky was clear and the light had that quality it got in spring, sharper than winter light, with actual intention behind it. They married at the hall rather than anywhere more formal, because neither of them was inclined toward ceremony, and because the hall was large enough that people who wanted to come could come, which turned out to be most of Clearwater. This surprised Gideon, and did not particularly surprise Eliza, who had a more accurate read on how curiosity and goodwill could coexist in a small town. Carl Reiter came and sat in the front row without being asked, and cried without any apparent embarrassment, which was consistent with being 81 and having earned the right to feel things openly. Mrs. Corbett came and wore her good dress, and stood near the back with the dignified expression of a woman who knew something was going to happen before most people did, and had the satisfaction of having been right. Henderson came and brought his wife. The Deaver family came, including Sam, who stood near the door with his arms crossed, and the expression of someone attending an event they consider themselves too old for but wouldn't have missed. Martha Hensley came. She sat 3 rows back and was perfectly well behaved, which Gideon privately found more unnerving than if she'd said something. She shook Eliza's hand afterward and said she hoped they'd be very happy, and she said it with enough genuine warmth that it was hard to be annoyed at the months of orchestrated observation that had preceded it. People were complicated. That was the thing about small towns. They gossiped and they pried and they measured everything against their own expectations. And then when you did the unexpected thing anyway, a fair number of them came around because, in the end, most people were rooting for something to work out. They just couldn't help themselves in the meantime. Robert Cartwright did not come. Nobody mentioned this, which was the kindest available option. The ceremony itself was short. Gideon had not been able to locate the right words for a speech, so he hadn't written one. When the moment came and someone asked if he had anything to say, he said, "I do, and I'll mean it longer than most men mean it," which was either romantic or pragmatic, depending on how you heard it, and Eliza heard it the right way, which was both. She wore a dark blue dress she'd ordered from a catalog 3 weeks after saying yes, which had arrived 4 days before the wedding and which fit imperfectly across the shoulders in a way she'd tried to fix herself with limited success. He wore his best coat and his second-best boots because his best boots had developed a problem with the left sole that he hadn't had time to address, and he thought briefly about this during the ceremony in a way that felt embarrassingly practical for the moment, but was also deeply characteristic of who he was, which perhaps was not the worst thing for a wedding to reveal. The ring on her hand was Margaret's ring, adjusted now by the jeweler in Billings to fit Eliza's finger properly. Gideon had driven out to Billings for this specifically, a 6-hour round trip because it mattered to get it right. Eliza had told him he didn't have to do that. He'd said he wanted to. Neither of them discussed it more than that, because some things were understood without being talked to death. After, there was food at the hall. The kind of food a community produced when it combined its resources, which was abundant and inconsistent and exactly right for the occasion. Gideon ate more than he expected to, which was a sign that his body had decided something his mind was still catching up to. Eliza moved through the room with the ease of a woman in her professional element, talking to everyone, and he watched her from across the hall with the particular feeling of a man noticing something for what feels like the first time, even though he's been looking at it for months. Carl found him at the edge of the room, predictably. "Well," Carl said. "Don't," Gideon said. "I was just going to say well. You were going to say something after well." Carl smiled the old, knowing smile. "I was going to say, I'm glad you didn't let the fear win." Gideon looked across the hall at Eliza, who was explaining something to the Deaver boy with the focused animation she brought to teaching things. Sam was actually listening, which was not his default setting. "I almost did," Gideon said. "I know," Carl said. "That's what makes it mean something." They stood there for a moment, 2 men watching a room full of people, and then Carl put a hand briefly on Gideon's arm. Not long, not sentimental, just a moment, and went to get more food because Carl Ryder had been on this earth long enough to know that sentiment and appetite were not mutually exclusive. The first months of the marriage were not easy, and anyone who told you otherwise would have been lying. Eliza moved her things from the boarding house to the ranch on a Sunday in early May, which took 2 wagon loads because she had more books than Gideon had anticipated. Not unreasonable for a schoolteacher, just unexpected in volume. They arranged them together on the shelf he built along the eastern wall of the sitting room in the 2 weeks before she arrived, which doubled the available space and still required some negotiation about organization because she organized by subject and he organized by size, and this turned out to be a more contested question than either of them had expected. "By size makes no sense," she said on the 3rd evening of discussing this, which was 2 evenings longer than it should have taken. "It makes visual sense," he said. "You don't look at books visually. You look for specific books." "I know where all my books are." "You know where all your books are. What about mine?" He looked at her. "I suppose you know where yours are. I know where mine are when they're organized by subject. When they're organized by size, I know where the tallest ones are." He thought about this. "Fine," he said. "By subject." "Thank you," she said, in a tone that was gracious and not entirely without triumph, and he found this specifically irritating and specifically endearing in equal measure, which was probably what marriage felt like from the inside. The physical work of integrating 2 lives into one space turned out to be both simpler and more complicated than the emotional version. The house had been a man's house, sparse, functional, arranged around practicality, and Eliza's presence changed it in ways that were not dramatic but were constant. She brought color, mostly, A rug she'd had in her rooms at the boarding house, curtains she sewed herself from fabric. Henderson ordered in for her, a series of small things that accumulated over weeks and altered the quality of being in each room without changing the structure of anything. Gideon noticed each addition without comment, except one evening when he walked through the sitting room and stopped and looked around and said, somewhat to his own surprise, "It looks like someone lives here." She turned from what she was doing at the desk. "Doesn't it always?" "Like someone actually lives here," he said. "Not just—" He stopped. "Not just survives here?" she said, not unkindly. He looked at her. "Something like that," he said. She had continued at the school through the spring term, which meant her days started early and ended in the late afternoon, and the domestic arrangement of the ranch fell on him during those hours, which was not entirely different from before, except that the context had changed in ways that changed the texture of the work. He made the coffee in the mornings, both cups, which was a small thing but not a nothing. He got used to the sound of another person in the house, the particular rhythm of Eliza getting ready for the day. Efficient, with occasional muttered commentary on whatever was not cooperating, and this sound, which he had not had in 11 years, turned out to be something he'd missed without having the word for it. They argued, not badly but genuinely, about the books, about how much the school was taking from her and whether she was eating enough during the day, about a decision he made about a fence line without consulting her that she found out about and had strong opinions on. The fence argument was the biggest one and lasted nearly 2 days, not because the fence itself was significant, but because underneath it was a question about what consulting each other meant in practice, and that question was one they hadn't answered yet. "You can manage the ranch," she said, on the second evening of the fence discussion. "I'm not trying to tell you how to do your work." "Then what are you telling me?" "I'm telling you that I live here too, and that decisions about the land we live on are decisions we make together." He sat with this. "I've been making those decisions alone for 30 years. "I know that," she said. "And now you're not alone. And that's going to take some getting used to, for both of us." She paused. "But I need you to try." He did try. It was not always graceful, and there were moments when the old habits of solitude reasserted themselves, and he'd realize mid-decision that he'd gone somewhere in his head that didn't account for her, and he'd have to come back out and explain himself, which he wasn't naturally good at. She was patient with this in a way that was real patience rather than performance. She didn't pretend not to notice, but she didn't weaponize it either. She just held her position, which he respected even when it cost him. Summer arrived, and the ranch became what it was in its best version. The high pasture green, the cattle settled, the days long enough that work could be done, and something like leisure could follow it. Eliza saw her first Montana summer, and it did to her exactly what he'd told her it would, back in December, when they'd been drinking coffee in his house, and he'd described the light at 10 o'clock in the evening, the wildflowers coming up fast, the way the land became briefly and completely itself. She stood in the upper pasture one evening in late June and looked at the mountains going pink in a light that had no business being that color, and she didn't say anything, and Gideon stood beside her and didn't say anything either, and it was a good kind of quiet. Not the quiet of a man keeping himself from wanting things, but the quiet of two people sharing the same view. The town adjusted as towns do, not all at once, and not without some residual friction. There were people who would always find the arithmetic of the marriage slightly off, who would always calculate it when they saw them together and come up with a number that made them uncomfortable. This did not go away entirely, and they both knew it wouldn't. But it became less present, less active, because there was nothing new to feed it. Gideon and Eliza simply went about their lives. He at the ranch, she at the school, both of them in town when there was reason to be, together without apology. And the visible ordinariness of it, sustained over weeks and then months, had an effect on even the most persistent skeptics. Martha Hensley stopped by the ranch in August, which Gideon would not have predicted in February, and which demonstrated something about the capacity for people to rearrange their thinking when the evidence became impossible to ignore. She came officially to bring preserves, plum, which she made every summer and distributed throughout the county as a social form of communication, and unofficially to look at the house and at them together and satisfy herself about something she'd been wondering. Eliza served her coffee and they talked for an hour. When Martha left, she said to Eliza at the door, "You've done something with this place." She looked at the sitting room behind them, the books and the rug and the curtains. It looks different. Better or worse? Eliza asked. Martha Hensley considered this with more genuine thought than Gideon expected. Better, she said. Warmer. She looked at Gideon, who was standing near the kitchen doorway. It suits you, she said, and it wasn't entirely clear whether she meant the house or Eliza or some compound of both. He nodded. She left. Eliza turned and looked at him. Martha Hensley thinks it suits you, she said. Apparently. Are you pleased about this? I'm not displeased, he said, which she understood was as close to pleased as his vocabulary ran in most situations, and which satisfied her. The pregnancy they discovered in October, 6 months after the wedding, which was earlier than either of them had anticipated or planned for, though planning had not been the primary mode of operation in their marriage from the start. Eliza received the news from the doctor in Clearwater on a Thursday afternoon and came home on the borrowed brown mare. She'd gotten better at riding over the summer, much better, though she still occasionally argued with the horse in ways that suggested she found the horse's decision-making suspect, and told him at the kitchen table. He sat very still for a moment. Gideon, she said. She was watching his face with the careful attention she always gave to his face when she needed to read it. Give me a second, he said. She gave him a second. He thought about 58. He thought about 60 and 65, and what it meant to be a father at those ages, the physical reality of it, the years he'd be asking his body to do things it would be less and less willing to do. He thought about a child who would grow up and look at the arithmetic the same way the town had, who would have a father already old on the day of their first memory. And then, underneath all of that, he thought about the upper pasture in June. He thought about the particular quiet of a house with someone else in it. He thought about the bookshelf organized by subject and the curtains in the sitting room and the morning coffee made for 2 and 11 years of managed silence that had been broken open by a woman who walked 3.5 miles in 15 degrees because she wanted to. He thought about what his life had been when he was careful, when he was reasonable, when he'd accepted that survival was what he was owed and nothing more. All right, he said. She looked at him. All right, she said. All right, he said again. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. We'll figure out the rest. She exhaled, a long breath she'd been holding since she sat down, and her hand turned under his and held on. They did figure out the rest. Not cleanly, not without difficulty, not in the smooth and easy way that people in stories sometimes managed. Eliza worked through the fall term and stopped at Christmas when the school hired a woman from Helena as a replacement, and the transition was harder for Eliza than she'd expected, because the school had been more central to her sense of herself than she'd fully understood until it wasn't daily anymore. She went through 3 weeks in January that were genuinely hard, not physically, but in the way that people struggle when the architecture of their days changes and they haven't built the new one yet. Gideon watched her during those weeks and didn't try to fix it, because he'd learned by then that some things couldn't be fixed from the outside, and that the most useful thing he could do was stay present and not pretend the difficulty wasn't real. She came through it. She reorganized the school curriculum from home. The new teacher was young and willing to correspond, and Eliza's letters became something close to a mentorship. And she started a lending library out of their sitting room, which was her idea, and which became by spring a genuine institution, people riding out from town to borrow books and returning them and occasionally staying for coffee and ending up in the kind of conversation that Eliza generated naturally and which Gideon participated in less and enjoyed more than he would have admitted. Their daughter arrived in June, the same month as the wildflowers, in the way that life arranged its timing without consulting anyone. They named her Clara, which had been Eliza's grandmother's name, and which Gideon thought suited her immediately, though he said this privately and waited 3 days before saying it out loud, because he was still a man who processed things at his own pace regardless of the circumstances. Clara was not an easy infant. She was loud and opinionated from the start, which Eliza said was a sign of character, and Gideon said was a sign of Eliza's influence, and both of these things were true, and neither of them said it without some affection. He held her in the early mornings when she woke before dawn, walking the kitchen floor with the particular gait of a large man trying to be quieter than his body naturally managed, while Eliza slept in the next room. And in these mornings, something settled in him that he hadn't known was still unsettled. He thought, in those mornings, about what he had almost not done, about all the arguments he'd made to himself over the winter, the arithmetic and the fear, and the reasonable case for staying exactly where he was. He thought about how close he'd come to letting those arguments win, how many times he'd been at the edge of simply not going forward, of writing a letter that said nothing important, of driving away from Clearwater and letting the distance accumulate into absence. He thought about the version of himself who had done that, who had turned the wagon home on that March day and not looked back, who had managed the grief into something so controlled it could no longer feel anything, who had grown old in a quiet house on the right side of the fear. He thought about that man with something close to pity, because here was what nobody told you about grief. Not the young kind, the fresh kind that everyone understood and offered food for, but the old, settled kind, the kind that had been with you so long it felt like a feature of the self rather than a wound. Nobody told you that it could end, not disappear. Grief didn't disappear, and the people who told you it did were either lying or had never loved anyone properly. But it could transform, the way hard things sometimes did, into something that no longer had the power to stop you. It could become part of the foundation rather than the ceiling, something you built on rather than something that kept you low. Gideon didn't have the language for this, and he wouldn't have said it out loud if he had, because he was still a man who kept the interior things interior. But he felt it on those early mornings with Clara, and later watching her take her first unsteady steps across the kitchen floor, and later still when she was 3 years old and fierce and chasing the ranch cats through the tall grass with the absolute conviction that she was going to catch one someday. Clara grew up on the ranch with the particular confidence of a child who is loved without performance, who has never had to wonder whether she belongs. She had Eliza's directness and something of Gideon's stillness. Not his silence, she was never silent, but his quality of noticing things, of seeing what was actually there rather than what was expected to be there. She climbed fences she shouldn't and argued about things she was too young to fully understand and asked questions at the dinner table that neither of her parents had ready answers for. When she was 5, she asked Gideon, "Were you always old?" Eliza, who was across the table, made a sound that was suppressing something. Gideon looked at his daughter. "No," he said, "not always." "What were you before?" "Young," he said. "Then less young, then older." He paused. "It goes in order." Clara considered this with the focus she applied to most things. "Will you be here when I'm grown up?" The question sat in the room. Eliza had gone still across the table. "I plan to be," he said. It was the most honest answer. Not a promise, because he had learned that some promises exceeded what a person could honestly give, but an intention stated plainly. Clara appeared satisfied with this, because children are often satisfied with honesty in ways that adults have forgotten how to be, and she went back to her dinner. Later, when Clara was asleep and the house had gone quiet, Eliza came and stood beside him on the porch, where he sometimes stood in the evenings, looking out at the property. The night was warm in the way Montana nights in summer were briefly and completely warm, and the stars were out in the complete way they were only possible far from any town. "She's going to be something," Eliza said. "She already is," he said. They stood there for a while. "Are you happy?" she asked. She asked it the way she asked things, straight, without apology, expecting a real answer. He thought about it. Not quickly, because quick answers to that question were rarely honest ones. He thought about the morning in November when he turned a damper handle and stayed for coffee because he couldn't think of a good reason not to. He thought about the letters, and the borrowed mare, and the frozen fence, and the small box on a dining room table in the early light. He thought about the quilt on the shelf in the bedroom, which was still there, which Eliza had never asked him to move, which meant something he didn't have a word for about the kind of woman she was. He thought about Clara chasing cats and the bookshelf organized by subject, and the curtains in the sitting room, and all the specific ordinary details of a life that had surprised him by continuing to arrive. "Yes," he said. It came out simple and uncomplicated in a way he hadn't expected, the way true things sometimes did when you finally stopped arguing with them. She leaned against his shoulder briefly, not dramatically, just the small animal comfort of two people who had been standing side by side long enough to do this without thinking about it. "Good," she said. They stood there until the night got cool enough to go in, and then they went in, and the house that had been quiet for 11 years was not quiet now and would not be again, and that was the thing that turned out to matter most. Not the arithmetic, not the town's opinions, not the fear, which was real, or the grief which was real, or the distance between 58 and 30, which was also real and also not the most important thing in the room. What mattered was the decision made fresh, every day, to be where you were and want what you had. To not mistake the absence of difficulty for the presence of good sense. To understand that the story you tell yourself about what you deserve can become the walls of a prison so comfortable you stop noticing it's a prison at all. Gideon Ashcroft had been inside those walls for 11 years. A closed damper and a cup of bad coffee, and a woman who asked real questions had been, in the end, enough to get him out. He was 63 years old when Clara first asked him to race her across the lower pasture, which he did, and lost, and didn't mind losing. He was 63 years old and not done. That, in the end, was the whole of it.